now like to invite Eva Peroni to speak with us. Could you please tell us your name and professional qualifications?
My name is Eva Peroni. I am an independent researcher and writer, and I focus on food and agricultural systems and politics.
From your experience, could you please talk about the current state of agriculture and its impact on land and natural resources?
Yes, so first I'd like to just preface this conversation by saying that in Australia, most environmental information relating to agriculture is fragmented and very difficult to access. It continues to be collected by individual and community land managers, public and private agencies, and primarily through short-term projects. So a lot of this data is rarely made available in information systems for others to use. And while there have been significant investments in building the infrastructure and capacity to facilitate the sharing of this environmental data, there really also needs to be a valuing of different forms of knowledge, knowledge that may not be generated through the scientific method, but is rather a collection of the lived-in experiences and the experiential knowledge of different land users and Indigenous peoples. So what we do know is that the combined impacts of land and water use for agriculture production in this country have been substantial. For example, the removal of native vegetation and the introduction of exotic species have contributed to the extinction and decline of many species of Australian wildlife. The construction of dams and diversion of water from rivers has greatly altered water flows. It reduces the amount of water flowing down rivers and has changed the times of peak flows. And there has been a deterioration of soil and water quality in many areas. So just taking a look at some of current agricultural pressures on land and natural resources, almost 2/3 of land in Australia has been modified for agricultural and other uses, and primarily the grazing of natural vegetation. Livestock grazing accounts for 82% of the area of land used in agriculture, more than 1/3 of which is in Queensland. Environmental issues associated with sheep and cattle grazing include habitat loss, surface soil loss, salinity, and soil and water degradation. Recent evidence supports an association between grazing by introduced herbivores such as cattle, horses, donkeys, and buffalo, and the magnitude of small mammal decline. Continuous dryland cropping increases nutrient runoff from fertilisers and pesticides and causes soil erosion and can contribute to rising water tables. Irrigated agriculture also contributes to rising salinity levels in the soil with runoff of sediments, nutrients, and pesticides. Industrial plantations or production forestry are typically made up of single species, often exotic to the region. They have a range of impacts on the environment, from altering local biodiversity to changing soil chemistry to increasing erosion during harvesting and planting. Generally, the more extensive native forest production estates available for commercial wood production rely on the selective harvest of a few target species. And they may interrupt ecosystem processes critical to some animal species, such as large nesting hollows for some birds and marsupials, or habitat for wood-boring invertebrates and their larvae. Livestock production is a dominant land use in the extensive land use zone of Australia. It is considered a major contributing factor to the decline of 8 threatened mammal species and a significant pressure on a further 8 near-threatened species. Recent evidence supports an association between grazing by introduced herbivores, as I mentioned before, and the magnitude of small mammal decline. Small mammal populations in Northern Australia have been shown to increase rapidly in diversity and abundance following destocking of grazing animals. The most extensive direct human pressure on the seabed in Australia is demersal trawling for fishes, prawns, and scallops by commercial fisheries. Worldwide, it is commonly understood that trawl gear has substantial direct impacts on seabed habitats, with most concerns surrounding impacts on delicate, long-lived structure-forming biota like the Great Barrier Reef, that may be easily damaged and slow to recover. Next one. So this is probably very difficult to read, but it is a graph of land use here in Australia. And you can see that as we go down the table, the majority of it is for agriculture, with only the last 3 for residential reasons. So just talking a little bit on agriculture and the impacts on land and soil, Australian soils are typically older, they're more deeply weathered, and they're less fertile than those of North America or Europe. As a result, many of the land degradation and soil management issues stem from attempts to apply European farming methods, crop varieties, and livestock breeds to distinctly Australian soils, landscapes, and climates. While there are still areas of highly fertile soil, a significant proportion of both cropland and improved pasture is affected by soil acidification, salinisation, erosion, nutrient imbalance, structural decline, loss of organic matter and consequently carbon, and other forms of degradation. So looking at diversified agroecological systems as an alternative to this industrial mode of agriculture in Australia, agriculture designed according to whole systems agroecological principles can contribute to creating more sustainable and resilient farming systems that regenerate or give back to rather than extract or take from the environment. The science of agroecology, which is defined as the application of ecological concepts and principles to the design and management of sustainable agroecosystems, provides a framework to help build the healthy agricultural systems that we need for the future. Agroecology is based on principles that support local and regional production, also with upholding a respectful dialogue with the local and Indigenous environmental knowledge, the interrelatedness of all agroecosystem components, including plant, animal, nutrient, and human life. An area used for agricultural production, like a field, is seen as a complex system in which ecological processes found under natural conditions should also occur. So things like nutrient cycling, predator-prey interactions, competition, and symbiosis. The goal is to design an agroecosystem that mimics the structure and function of local natural ecosystems. That is, a system with high species diversity and biologically active soil, one that promotes natural pest control, nutrient recycling, and high soil cover to prevent resource losses. There is growing evidence that these systems keep carbon in the ground, support and enhance biodiversity, rebuild soil fertility, and sustain yields over time, providing a basis for both ecological restoration and secure farm livelihoods. In Australia and across the globe, change is already happening. Industrial food systems are being challenged on multiple fronts, from new forms of cooperation and knowledge creation to the development of strong evidence that agroecological systems can regenerate the earth, to the rise of global social movements calling for agroecologically managed farming systems. The future of our food systems in Australia requires a reimagining of agriculture as we know it, grounded in the principle of working with rather than against nature.
Does the panel have any questions for Eva?
Thank you. I have a quick one. Did you want to go first?
Oh, okay.
You go first.
Thanks for that. I really appreciate that. It's enlightening. I just got one question.
Yes.
From your understanding, in terms of volume, how much herbicides and pesticides are used in Australia on an annual basis?
Oh,
If you know it.
Yeah, I don't actually have the answer to that question. But a lot of the herbicide and pesticide use is used for creating grains that don't actually feed people, but often feed livestock. So when we are looking at how much of that is used in different systems, we've also got to think about how those systems that those pesticides and fertilisers are used aren't for our consumption, but are for another species consumption that we'll then eat later down the track. I know that we are having very significant issues with soil, and a lot of that is to do with using fertilisers that our soils are not able to hold on to and utilise, because we do have a very unique soil climate here in Australia. Throwing on these chemically engineered pesticides and fertilisers that have really been developed for other soil systems creates massive damage, not just to soil structure, soil biota and soil carbon, but they leach then into our waterways and pollute all our water tables. So I don't really have an idea of the volume in which they're used, but I know that they're having significant impacts on our landscape and waterways here in Australia.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's a great segue to my question. I was interested to hear you say that the information out there about agriculture is fragmented and it's difficult to get data. Can you talk a little bit more about why that is and what we might do as ordinary folks to understand what's going on and how many chemicals, how do we get a handle on the sheer volume of fragmented info?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for that question, because it's really important. Just to give an idea, the last government paper that I found that gave an all-encompassing look at agriculture and its impact on the environment dated back to 2006. I couldn't find any recent information. There are a few reasons why this is. That's largely because agricultural research and extension is privatised. So it's done to serve the interests of certain companies and certain short-term projects rather than serve the integrated knowledge system that we really need to build to understand agriculture and its impact on the environment. Something that I've found now, which is an extension of that, is that most research is looking into climate change's impact on certain crops, and that's usually driven by an economic they want economic information out of that. So they want to know how it's going to impact those crops, because how is that going to impact our market? So a lot of the research is driven by private interests. The government is starting to come around, especially in relation to soils, after 15 years of having no real research in that area. They've realised that they have to start bringing together these different forms of knowledge and these different forms of research into a more integrated infrastructure. Otherwise, it's going to continue off in little groups. So I think there needs to be change on a policy level for that. There needs to be a coordinated body that can bring in this kind of information, and we need to make sure that that information isn't just privileging one direction of research, looking at certain sectors, but is instead privileging a broader range of knowledge and information that we can build together to really address the problem.
Thank you. It's a really excellent and important point, and particularly for the work that many of us connected to the Earth Laws movement and Earth democracy and even green prints and bioregional governance. We're very interested in how we can make accessible to people complex, unavailable information. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.